8 years ago, a teenage girl climbed out of a window in California carrying a cell phone that her parents did not know she had. She had spent most of her life isolated from the outside world. She was terrified that if she was caught, she might never get another chance. But Julissa Turpin kept moving. She reached the street, called 911, and told a dispatcher something almost impossible to believe. Her brothers and sisters were trapped inside. Some were chained. That phone call eventually led deputies to a home in Paris, California, where 13 siblings were rescued from years of starvation, confinement, and abuse. For most people watching the story unfold, January 14, 2018 looked like the ending. The children were out. Their parents were arrested. The nightmare was over. But years later, the Turpin siblings would reveal something much more complicated. Rescue was not the end of their story. In some ways, it was the beginning of an entirely different struggle. And now, in rural Ohio, 16 other children may be standing at the beginning of that same uncertain road. On June 30th, 2026, investigators entered a home in the small village of Hamden, Ohio. What authorities say they found immediately turned an ordinary criminal investigation into one of the most disturbing child endangerment cases the state had seen in years. 16 children were inside. They ranged in age from about 18 months to 18 years. Authorities said the children had been living in an area measuring roughly 12 feet by 12 feet. Officials described the conditions as filthy and dangerous. Several children needed hospital treatment. 2 were transported to Level 1 trauma centers. Ohio Attorney General Andy Wilson later said that if authorities had arrived much later, investigators might have been dealing with deaths instead of a rescue. 4 adults were arrested: Gary Siders Jr., his wife Elizabeth Siders, Gary's father Gary Siders Sr., and his mother Christina Siders. They currently face multiple felony child endangerment charges and have pleaded not guilty. Those charges remain allegations unless proven in court. But while the criminal cases begin moving through the legal system, another question is becoming increasingly important. What happens to the children now? That question took on new meaning when Julissa Turpin spoke publicly about the Ohio case. Julissa was one of the younger children rescued from the Turpin home in California. When she looks at the 16 children from Ohio, she is not looking at the story the way most of us do. She understands something almost no outsider can fully understand. She knows what it feels like to leave a world of confinement and suddenly enter a world that everyone else considers normal. And according to Julissa, normal life can be frightening when you have never really experienced it. Think about that for a moment. Most children grow up learning thousands of ordinary things without even realizing they are learning them. They learn how classrooms work. They learn how to make friends. They learn how to ask a stranger for help. They learn what happens at a doctor's office. They learn when to speak, when to listen, how to cross a street, how to buy something in a store, and how to understand what another person's intentions might be. For a child who has spent years isolated from society, none of those things can be assumed. Julissa has described how strange the outside world felt after her rescue. Even seeing trees and breathing fresh air could feel extraordinary. Things that other people barely notice could feel almost unbelievable. And this is why the Ohio story may be entering its most important phase. The children survived the house. Now they have to learn how to live outside it. There were warning signs long before police entered the Hamden property. Court records obtained by WSAZ showed that 6 Siders children had once been enrolled at Adaville Elementary School. By the 2021 school year, those 6 children had accumulated extraordinary absences. Complaints filed by the school district said they had missed every day of school for months. The children were classified as habitual truants. School officials had attempted to address the problem. But in January 2022, the cases were dismissed because authorities could not locate the parents. Then the family effectively disappeared from the educational system. That detail matters because school is about far more than academics. For vulnerable children, teachers, nurses, counselors, bus drivers, and other students form a network of outside observers. A teacher may notice dramatic weight loss. A school nurse may notice untreated injuries. A counselor may notice that a child is frightened to go home. A classmate may hear something that eventually reaches an adult. When children disappear from school completely, one of society's most important lines of visibility disappears with them. In the Ohio case, investigators are still reconstructing exactly what happened during those missing years. A gag order now limits what prosecutors, law enforcement officials, and some attorneys can publicly say about the case. That means there are still major unanswered questions. But we do know that caring for 16 children with potentially extensive medical, educational, and psychological needs is placing an extraordinary burden on the local system. Vinton County is small. Its resources are limited. Taking 16 children into protective care effectively transformed the size of the county's child welfare responsibility overnight. Ohio responded by approving $1 million in emergency funding. That money is intended to help cover treatment, placement, clothing, court expenses, and other needs associated with caring for the children. State officials have said many of them may require therapeutic foster care for a long time. At the same time, prosecutors have said the state is seeking permanent custody through juvenile court proceedings. That means another enormous decision lies ahead. Where will 16 brothers and sisters live? Can some of them remain together? How will authorities balance sibling bonds with specialized medical and therapeutic needs? How do you teach children to trust adults when the adults responsible for protecting them are accused of being the people who failed them? There are no easy answers, and the Turpin case demonstrates exactly why those questions matter. After Jordan Turpin escaped in 2018, Americans watched deputies enter the family's California home. The 13 siblings ranged from 2 years old to 29. Prosecutors later described years of starvation, beatings, restraints, denial of medical care, and extreme isolation. David and Louise Turpin eventually pleaded guilty to 14 felony counts. In 2019, both were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Again, that seemed like justice. But justice in a courtroom and recovery in real life are not the same thing. Some of the younger Turpin siblings entered foster care, hoping to finally experience safety. Years later, that part of their story became another scandal. Several siblings alleged that they were abused again after being placed with a foster family. Criminal cases followed. In 2024, foster father Marcelino Olguin was convicted on multiple charges related to abuse of children in the home. Other family members also entered guilty pleas to charges connected with mistreatment. And in 2022, an independent investigation commissioned by Riverside County reached a devastating conclusion. The system that was supposed to help the Turpin siblings had failed them in significant ways. Investigators documented problems ranging from housing instability and food insecurity for some of the older siblings to failures in communication, coordination, and access to services. Imagine what that means psychologically. A child spends years believing the world outside the home is dangerous. Eventually, someone rescues that child and says the outside world is safe. Then the system places that child into another environment where abuse happens again. What does that teach the child about trust? What does that teach the child about asking for help? That is why Julissa Turpin's message to the Ohio children carries so much weight. She is not promising that everything will suddenly become easy. She is saying almost the opposite. Adjusting can be extremely difficult. Healing can take years. But she also represents evidence that a future is possible. Julissa has spoken about therapy, relationships with her siblings, and slowly building an independent life. Earlier this year, she publicly celebrated completing a half marathon. She has bought a home. She spends time with people and animals she loves. These things may sound ordinary, but for someone whose childhood involved confinement and deprivation, ordinary life can represent something extraordinary. Independence, choice, safety, the ability to decide what happens next. That brings us back to the 16 children in Ohio. Much of their individual information is protected, as it should be. The public does not need their names, photographs, or exact locations. Their privacy may become one of the most important protections they have. What the public does need to know is whether the system responsible for them has learned from cases like Turpin. The Ohio government has already committed substantial financial resources. That is important. But money alone cannot repair years of isolation. These children may need medical treatment. They may need speech therapy. Some may need extensive educational support. They may need trauma specialists. They may need adults who understand why an ordinary question, touch, or household rule could trigger fear. They may also need something that cannot easily be written into a government budget. Time. A child who has lived in survival mode does not simply switch that instinct off because the front door has finally opened. Experts who work with severely neglected children often emphasize stability, predictable routines, and relationships with trustworthy caregivers. And stability could become especially complicated in a family of 16 siblings. Placement capacity is limited. Therapeutic homes are limited. Keeping all 16 together may be unrealistic. Separating them, however, could create another major loss. For children raised almost entirely inside one family unit, brothers and sisters may be among the only familiar relationships they have ever known. That does not automatically mean every sibling relationship is healthy. It does mean authorities face decisions far more complicated than simply finding 16 beds. Meanwhile, the adults accused in the case are beginning their own legal battles. Elizabeth Sider's attorney recently requested a mental competency evaluation. The filing raises questions about whether she is capable of understanding the proceedings and assisting in her defense. Her attorney has also requested that if she is found competent, she be evaluated regarding her mental condition at the time of the alleged offenses. Similar competency questions have emerged involving other defendants. None of that determines guilt. Competency to stand trial is a legal question about a person's current ability to understand and participate in a case. It is not the same as deciding whether that person committed the alleged acts. Elizabeth's history has also generated another difficult debate. Records show that she married Gary Siders Jr. in West Virginia in 2008. She was 15 years old. Her defense attorney has suggested that aspects of her own history could become relevant when evaluating her role in the family. That raises a question that true crime audiences often want answered with a simple yes or no. Can someone be both a victim and responsible for harm? Julissa Turpin has a deeply personal perspective on that question. She has spoken about her own mother, Louise. Julissa can acknowledge that complicated experiences may exist in an adult's history, while still refusing to erase what happened to the children. That distinction matters. Understanding how abuse develops is not the same as excusing abuse. A criminal court will eventually decide legal responsibility in the Ohio case. Mental health experts may help determine whether individual defendants are competent to participate in that process. But the children's recovery cannot wait for every legal question to be resolved. Their lives are happening now. They are waking up in unfamiliar rooms, meeting unfamiliar adults, eating different food, hearing different sounds, possibly sleeping alone for the first time, possibly attending medical appointments they have never experienced before, and eventually, some may enter classrooms filled with children who have lived lives completely different from their own. That transition could be liberating. It could also be terrifying. The world may finally be open to them, but they still have to learn how that world works. The Turpin siblings learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Jordan had to escape once from her parents. Some of her younger siblings later said they effectively had to escape danger again after entering the child welfare system. That history now stands as a warning for Ohio. Do not confuse removal with recovery. Do not assume that because a child has been moved into a clean house, the trauma has disappeared. Do not assume that giving someone food automatically teaches that person to feel safe around food. Do not assume that enrolling a teenager in school immediately replaces years of lost education. And above all, do not assume that a child who has survived adults will automatically know how to trust another adult. On the day investigators entered the Hamden home, the immediate goal was survival. Get the children out. Get medical help. Remove them from danger. That part happened. Now comes something slower and much harder to measure. Building 16 lives. 8 years after the California House of Horrors was exposed, Julissa Turpin can look back and describe things she once could barely imagine. Friends, therapy, a home of her own, a dog, a future she gets to choose. Her life does not erase what happened to her, but it does show what the children in Ohio desperately need to know. The room where your story began does not have to be the place where your story ends. The question now is whether the adults and institutions surrounding these 16 children can give them something they may never have had before. Not simply freedom from one house, but a genuine chance to build a safe life outside it. Because history has already shown us that opening the door is only the first step. What happens after the rescue may determine everything.